September 30th, 1949. Small courthouse in Philadelphia. 27-year-old Charles Buchinsky stood in an ill-fitting borrowed suit next to Harriet Tendler, a quiet, intelligent woman who worked as a radio actress. They had $50 between them. No honeymoon, no reception, just a marriage certificate and a promise that somehow they could make it work. Harriet looked at Charles, this rough, scarred man from the coal mines, who dreamed of becoming an actor, and she believed in him when nobody else did. She would spend the next 16 years supporting him, sacrificing for him, believing in him. And then, in 1965, when Charles finally achieved the success they would fought for together, he left her. For another woman, for Jill Ireland. This is the story nobody tells. The story of Harriet Tendler, the woman who saved Charles Bronson and got nothing in return, except heartbreak and a lesson about what happens when you give everything to someone who is only passing through your life on the way to somewhere else. Harriet Tendler was not supposed to end up with a man like Charles Buchinsky. She came from a middle-class Jewish family in Philadelphia. Her father was a businessman. Her mother was educated, cultured. Harriet grew up with books, music, theater. She was smart, graduating from high school with honors. She wanted to be an actress, but the respectable kind. Stage plays, radio dramas, serious work. She had ambitions, but they were refined ambitions, the kind that involved art, not survival. Charles Buchinsky, on the other hand, came from nothing. A coal mining town, a family of 15 children, a father who died when Charles was 10. A childhood spent in darkness, hauling coal, breathing dust, wondering if he would die in those tunnels like so many men before him. When Charles returned from World War II in 1945, he was 23 years old with no skills except shooting a gun and surviving. He drifted for a while, working construction, trying to figure out what to do with his life. And someone told him about a theater group in Philadelphia that needed help building sets. Charles showed up, hammer in hand, ready to work. He did not know anything about theater. He would barely seen a play in his life, but he knew how to build things, and he needed the money. That is where he met Harriet. She was rehearsing for a radio drama, practicing her lines in the corner of the theater. Charles was hauling lumber across the stage. Their worlds should never have intersected, but they did. Harriet noticed Charles immediately, not because he was handsome, though he had a certain rough appeal, but because he was different from the other actors and crew members. He did not talk much. He moved with purpose. There was something solid about him, something real in a world full of people pretending to be things they were not. One day, Harriet asked Charles if he would read lines with her. She needed someone to practice a scene. Charles hesitated. "I'm not an actor," he said. His accent was thick, Eastern European, the English still rough around the edges. "You do not have to be," Harriet replied. "Just read the words." Charles read the words, badly, stumbling over pronunciation, missing cues. But Harriet saw something. She saw that when Charles spoke, even poorly, there was an authenticity that most trained actors lacked. He was not performing. He was just being. And in that being, there was power. After the rehearsal, Harriet did something that would change both their lives. She told Charles he should take acting classes. Charles laughed. "I cannot afford acting classes. I can barely afford food." Harriet did not push. She just said, "If you ever want to try, let me know. I will help you." Over the next few months, Charles and Harriet became friends. She would practice her lines with him, would build her sets. They talked. Slowly at first, then more openly. Charles told her about the coal mines, about his father's death, about the war. Harriet told him about her dreams of being an actress, about feeling trapped in a respectable life that felt too small for her ambitions. They were both outsiders in different ways, both searching for something they could not quite name. In 1949, their friendship became something more. Charles kissed Harriet after a late-night rehearsal. She kissed him back. And suddenly, this rough coal miner and this cultured radio actress were in love. Harriet's family was horrified. Charles Buchinsky, the man who could barely speak proper English, the man with no money, no education, no prospects. He was not suitable. He would never amount to anything. Harriet should marry a doctor, a lawyer, someone respectable. But Harriet did not care what her family thought. She saw something in Charles that they did not see. She saw potential. She saw determination. She saw a man who would never quit. They got married in September 1949. Harriet's family did not attend. It was just Charles and Harriet in a courthouse, making promises they both meant, for better or worse, in sickness and health. Until death do us part. Charles promised Harriet he would make something of himself. He would become an actor. He would give her the life she deserved. Harriet believed him. More importantly, she decided to make those promises come true herself. The early years of their marriage were brutal. Charles could not find acting work. He was too rough, too ethnic, too old. Hollywood wanted young, handsome, all-American types. Charles was none of those things. He took whatever jobs he could find: construction, loading docks, anything that paid. Harriet supported them by doing radio work, voiceovers, or whatever small acting gigs she could book. She made more money than Charles did. She was the breadwinner, while her husband chased an impossible dream. But Harriet never made Charles feel small for earning less. She believed in his dream because she understood what it was like to want something desperately. Instead of discouraging him, she supported him. She paid for his acting classes at the Pasadena Playhouse. She typed his resumes. She helped him practice audition scenes. When Charles came home defeated after another rejection, Harriet would tell him, "They are wrong. They just do not see it yet, but they will." And Charles would believe her because he needed to believe someone. In 1951, Charles got his first film role. It was tiny, uncredited. He played a sailor in You Are in the Navy Now. He had no lines. He just stood in the background, but it was a start. Over the next few years, Charles appeared in dozens of films, always small roles, always forgettable. The thug, the henchman, the heavy. Directors liked that he looked real, that he brought authenticity to even the smallest parts. But nobody thought of him as the leading man. Nobody except Harriet. During these years, Harriet put her own acting career on hold, not because Charles asked her to, but because someone needed to provide stability. Someone needed to pay the rent, keep the lights on, make sure there was food on the table. And Charles was gambling everything on his dream, so Harriet became the anchor. She took steady work. She made sacrifices. She told herself it was temporary. Once Charles broke through, once he became successful, then she could pursue her own dreams again. She was investing in their future together. In 1952 and 1954, Harriet and Charles had 2 children, Suzanne and Tony. Now, Harriet was not just supporting Charles financially and emotionally. She was raising 2 children while her husband chased an acting career that showed no signs of paying off. Friends told her to leave him, to find someone more stable, someone who could actually provide for his family. But Harriet refused. She had made a promise, and more than that, she still believed. Even when Charles did not believe in himself anymore, Harriet believed for both of them that the strain was showing. Charles was gone constantly, traveling for small roles that paid almost nothing. When he was home, he was frustrated, angry at his lack of success. He would drink too much, withdraw into himself. Harriet tried to reach him, but Charles had built walls around himself. He would learn in the coal mines and the war that showing vulnerability meant weakness, so he shut down, and Harriet, who had given up everything to support him, felt increasingly alone. By the late 1950s, Charles's career finally started to improve. He got bigger roles. He worked with major directors. In 1960, he appeared in The Magnificent Seven, which became a huge hit. Charles was finally getting noticed, not as a star yet, but as a serious actor, someone who could carry a scene, someone who mattered. After a decade of struggle, success was finally within reach. Harriet felt vindicated. All those years of sacrifice, of believing, of holding their family together, while Charles chased his dream, it was finally paying off. But success changed Charles. Or maybe it just revealed who he had always been. As his career grew, he spent more time away from home. He was filming in Europe and Mexico, traveling constantly. Harriet stayed in Los Angeles with the children, managing their lives, being mother and father. When Charles came home, he was different, distant, distracted. He had tasted success, and he wanted more. He was obsessed with his career, in a way that left no room for anything or anyone else. In 1963, Charles was cast in The Great Escape, a major war film with an all-star cast. One of his co-stars was David McCallum, a British actor. David was married to Jill Ireland, a beautiful actress who had appeared in several British films. Charles, David, and Jill became friends. They socialized together. Harriet even met Jill a few times, thought she was lovely. There was no reason to be concerned. Charles and Jill were just friends, colleagues, nothing more, except it was more. Charles fell in love with Jill Ireland. He tried to resist it. He was married. He had children. He had a wife who had sacrificed everything for him. But Charles Bronson had spent his entire life taking what he wanted through sheer force of will, and he wanted Jill. In 1965, Charles told Harriet he was leaving her. He was in love with someone else. He wanted a divorce. Harriet was devastated. After 16 years, after supporting him through poverty, rejection, failure, after believing in him when nobody else did, after putting her own dreams aside, after raising his children, he was leaving her for another man's wife, for Jill Ireland. Harriet begged him to reconsider. Think about the children. Think about everything we have built together. But Charles was unmovable. His mind was made up. He said he was sorry, but he could not help how he felt. He loved Jill. He wanted to be with her. And that was that. No amount of history, no amount of sacrifice, no amount of royalty mattered more than what Charles wanted in that moment. The divorce was finalized in one. Charles married Jill Ireland in 1968. He adopted her 2 sons from her marriage to David McCallum. He built a new life with Jill, a glamorous life, a successful life. He and Jill became one of Hollywood's power couples, appearing in 15 films together, traveling the world, living the dream that Charles and Harriet had once imagined for themselves. Harriet was left with 2 children, a broken heart, and the bitter knowledge that she had been a stepping stone. She had been useful when Charles needed support, needed belief, needed someone to carry him through the hard years. But once he achieved success, once he became Charles Bronson instead of Charles Buchinsky, he did not need her anymore. He needed someone who fit his new life, someone glamorous, someone who had not seen him at his lowest, someone who did not remind him of all the years of failure. For years, Harriet said nothing publicly about Charles. She raised Suzanne and Tony, went back to work, rebuilt her life. She did not give bitter interviews. She did not write a tell-all book. She maintained her dignity even when Charles had taken everything else from her. But in 2006, 3 years after Charles died, Harriet finally told her story in an interview. She was asked if she resented Charles for leaving her after all she had done for him. Harriet was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I did not think Charles was capable of gratitude the way most people understand. He would survive the coal mines by taking what he needed and not looking back. He would survive the war the same way, and he survived Hollywood by being ruthless, even with the people who loved him. I think he convinced himself that leaving me was necessary, that his relationship with Jill was destiny, that he could not help it. But the truth is, he made a choice. He chose his career and his new life over loyalty to the person who made that new life possible. Do I resent him for it? I did for a long time. But now I just feel sad. Sad for him that he could not see what he was throwing away. Sad for me that I wasted 16 years loving someone who was always going to leave. The story of Charles Bronson and Harriet Tendler is difficult because there are no clear villains. Charles did not abuse Harriet. He did not cheat on her in the traditional sense. The relationship with Jill began after he had already decided to leave. He was honest about his feelings, as honest as Charles Bronson knew how to be. But honesty does not make hurt less painful. And the fact that Charles fell in love with someone else does not erase the 16 years Harriet spent building him into the man who could attract someone like Jill Ireland. Here's the uncomfortable truth that the Harriet Tendler story reveals. Sacrifice does not guarantee loyalty. Supporting someone through their worst years does not mean they will stay with you during their best years. Sometimes you give everything to someone and they still leave. Not because you did anything wrong, but because people change. Success changes people. And a person you married when they were struggling might not be the person they become when they are successful. Charles Bronson married Harriet when he was Charles Buchinsky, a broke nobody with a dream. She believed in Charles Buchinsky. She loved Charles Buchinsky. But by the time Charles became Charles Bronson, international star, he was a different person. He had different needs, different desires, a different vision of who he wanted to be. And Harriet, who represented his past, his struggle, his years of failure, did not fit into that vision anymore. Was Charles wrong to leave Harriet? Most people would say yes. After everything she did for him, he owed her loyalty. He owed her gratitude. He owed her the success they would build together. But Charles did not see it that way. In Charles's mind, he had worked for his success. He had endured the rejections, the small roles, the years of being told he was not good enough. Yes, Harriet had supported him, but he had done the work. And now that he would finally achieved his dreams, why should he stay in a marriage that felt like a reminder of all those painful years? It is a selfish perspective, but it is also human. How many people stay in relationships out of obligation rather than love? How many people sacrifice their happiness because they feel they owe someone? Charles chose himself. He chose his own happiness over Harriet's feelings, over the guilt, over the judgment of others. Was it cruel? Yes. Was it honest? Also yes. But here is what Charles lost by leaving Harriet. He lost the one person who had loved him unconditionally. Jill Ireland was beautiful, talented, wonderful. But Jill fell in love with Charles Bronson, a star. Harriet loved Charles Buchinsky, struggling nobody. There is a difference. You need to love someone before they are successful. You love them for who they are, not what they can give you. Harriet's love was pure in a way that no subsequent relationship could ever match. And Charles threw it away. Years later, after Jill died in 1990, Charles was alone. He eventually remarried, 1998, to Kim Weeks, but friends said he was never the same after losing Jill. In his final years, Charles was reported to have expressed regret about many things in his life, relationships he would damaged, choices he would made. People who asked him about Harriet said Charles would change the subject. He did not want to talk about her, maybe because he knew he would have been wrong, maybe because admitting it was too painful. Harriet Tendler, Untold 2016. She died at 96 years old, having outlived Charles by 13 years. She never remarried. She focused on her children and her grandchildren, her own small acting career that she revived after the divorce. She built a life that was not defined by Charles Bronson. But in interviews late in her life, when asked about her biggest regret, Harriet would say, "I regret not valuing myself as much as I valued Charles. I taught him that my dreams were less important than his, that my sacrifices were expected, that I would always be there, no matter how little he gave back, and he learned that lesson too well." The legacy of Harriet Tendler is not just her sacrifice. It is the warning her story provides. Love should be reciprocal. Support should be mutual. Sacrifice should be acknowledged and appreciated. When you give everything to someone else's dream, make sure they are also invested in yours. Because if you are not careful, wake up one day and realize you have spent years building someone else's life, while your own life passed you by. Charles Bronson became a legend. He achieved everything he dreamed of and more. He became rich, famous, successful, but he did it by leaving behind the woman who made it all possible. And whether he ever admitted it or not, at loss, that betrayal of someone who believed in him when no one else did was a stain on his legacy that no amount of success could erase. Harriet Tendler deserved better. She deserved loyalty. She deserved gratitude. She deserved to share in the success she helped create. But she got none of those things. She got 16 years of sacrifice, a divorce, and a lifetime of wondering why love was not enough.